Good afternoon, students. In our last session, we had discussed hypothesis and various sources of hypothesis. In today's session, we are going to discuss different types of hypothesis. So let's start with research hypothesis. So, the research hypothesis could be understood in terms of simple research hypothesis and complex research hypothesis. A simple research hypothesis predicts the relationship between a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. What is a simple research hypothesis? Which predicts the relationship between a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. Whereas a complex hypothesis predicts the relationship between two or more independent variables and two or more dependent variables. So, a complex hypothesis predicts the relationship between two or more independent variables and two or more dependent variables. A research hypothesis must be stated in a testable form for its proper evaluation, and it should indicate a relationship between variables in clear, concise, and understandable language. Research hypothesis is further classified as being directional and non-directional. Research hypothesis is classified as being directional and non-directional. Directional hypothesis. These are usually derived from theory. These are usually derived from theory. They may imply that the researcher is intellectually committed to a particular outcome. They specify the expected direction of the relationship between variables. Remember, they specify the expected direction of the relationship between different variables. Expected direction can be guessed by the researcher where it will go. That is, the researcher predicts not only the existence of a relationship, but at the same time, he or she predicts its nature. Non directional, used when there is little or no theory, or when findings are or previous studies are contradictory. So it is non directional. They may imply impartiality, do not stipulate the direction of the relationship. So, again, a research hypothesis must be stated in testable form for its proper evaluation. This form should indicate a relationship between the variables in clear, concise, and understandable language. Research hypothesis are as being directional or non-directional. The hypotheses which stipulate the direction of the expected differences or relationships are termed as directional hypotheses. Research hypotheses are as being directional or non-directional. The hypothesis which stipulate the relationship which stipulate the direction of the expected differences or relationships are termed as directional hypothesis. Remember, which stipulate the direction of the expected differences or relationships are termed as directional hypothesis. Let's take an example. There is a positive relationship between the academic achievement and study habits of students, is a directional hypothesis, because hypothesis stipulates that students with good study habits will have higher academic achievement, or they will have higher academic achievement rate. Or similarly, students with high test anxiety will score badly in examinations as compared to students with low anxiety, is a directional research hypothesis because it stipulates the direction of the difference between the groups. There are two groups: students with high test anxiety and low anxiety level. So it stipulates the direction of the difference between the groups: high test anxiety, higher or low level of anxiety. A research hypothesis which does not specify the direction of expected differences or relationships is a non-directional research hypothesis. A research hypothesis which does not specify the direction of expected differences. Remember, which does not specify the direction of expected differences or relationships is a non-directional research hypothesis. For example, there is a difference in the academic achievement of B.Ed students enrolled in open universities, is a non-directional research hypothesis. Although the hypothesis stipulates that there is a difference in academic achievement, but the direction of the difference is not clear. The direction of the difference is not specified by the researcher. So, a hypothesis can take either the declarative form or the null form or the question form. When the researcher makes a positive statement, remember, when the researcher makes a positive statement about the outcome of the study, the hypothesis takes the declarative form. When the researcher makes a positive statement about the outcome of the study, the hypothesis takes the declarative form. It is more or less a directional hypothesis. For example, the attitude of parents in the rural areas towards education of girls is significantly negative in comparison to the attitude of parents in urban areas, is stated in the declarative term. declarative form. In the null form, the researcher makes a statement that no relationship exists. In the null form, the researcher makes a statement that there does not exist or there exists no relationship. The hypothesis: there is no difference in the attitude of parents of rural and urban areas towards co-education, is an example of null hypothesis that no relationship exists. Null hypothesis is used to test statistically the research hypothesis, which has been stated in directional or non-directional form. Null hypothesis is also called testing hypothesis when a directional, declarative, or non-directional hypothesis is tested statistically by converting it into null form. A null hypothesis challenges the assertion of a declarative hypothesis. Research hypothesis and null hypothesis. The research or scientific hypothesis is a formal affirmative statement that predicts the tentative explanation of the relationship between two or more variables. The research or scientific hypothesis is a formal affirmative statement that predicts the tentative explanation of the relationship between two or more variables. A research hypothesis describes what operations were conducted and tools were used to measure each variable. A research hypothesis describes what operations were conducted and tools were used to measure each variable. Thus, the focus of a hypothesis depends upon the type of target population, how the data are collected, and what measures are to be used. The whole research process is built on a research hypothesis which illustrates a theory. It is a positive and general kind of a statement. For example, there is a learning style there is a difference between the learning style of boys and girls. This hypothesis is also known as H1 or general hypothesis or empirical hypothesis, experimental or theory or substantive or operation hypothesis. This hypothesis, however, cannot be tested, proved, or disproved. It constitutes the prediction derived from a theory under test. It is also called an alternative hypothesis, as the conclusions are drawn only after accepting or rejecting null hypothesis. So it is also called an alternative hypothesis, as the conclusions are drawn only after accepting or rejecting null hypothesis. Siegel states that if the null hypothesis is rejected, then the alternative hypothesis may be accepted. Thus, the alternative hypothesis is a prediction derived from a theory under test, whereas the null hypothesis is a hypothesis of indicating no difference or no relationship. It is a neutral type of hypothesis. It denies the existence of any systematic principle apart from the effect of chance. It assumes that none or zero difference exists between two population means or treatment. Null hypothesis is a statistical hypothesis which is tested with the framework of the probability theory. The alternative hypothesis is an operational statement of research hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is an operational statement of research hypothesis. The research hypothesis is the prediction derived from the theory under test. So, by rejecting or accepting a null hypothesis, one arrives at the conclusion about the research hypothesis. Thus, the relationship between research hypothesis H1 and the null hypothesis is that if null hypothesis is rejected, then the research hypothesis is accepted. But in the beginning stage, the researcher makes an affirmative statement as a prediction of solution that he or she is supposed to test later. At the stage of statistical analysis of data, the research hypothesis is converted into null hypothesis. All statistical tests are the test for null hypothesis. Rejecting or accepting null hypothesis asserts that observed difference or relationship may result from chance errors due to sampling procedure. Testing of hypothesis. After formulation of hypothesis, testing of the hypothesis is the next step. After the hypotheses are stated, the researcher moves towards testing them. After the hypotheses are stated, the researcher moves towards testing them. Hypotheses are subjected to empirical as well as logical testing. The nature of a hypothesis may be simple or complex. A simple hypothesis is tested directly, but in a complex hypothesis, but a complex hypothesis cannot be tested directly. It may be tested in terms of its deducted consequences. In order to test the hypothesis in forms of deducted consequences, it is necessary to collect evidence by selecting, developing data collecting tools to analyze the data collection, and then interpret results in the light of hypothesis and its deduced consequences. The necessary conditions for confirmation are: number one, all factual evidence collected through test or other means should correspond with the deduced consequences of the study. The data collecting tools should take into account all factors, conditions that are suggested by the consequences. Last, the consequences are logically deduced from the hypothesis. Suppose the teacher wants to test the hypothesis effective uh, effective teachers will have higher level of job satisfaction. This hypothesis cannot be tested directly by all the researchers. Why? He has to proceed indirectly by deducing the consequences that ineffective teachers will have low level of job satisfaction as compared to that of effective teachers. In this way, the researcher does not test the hypothesis, but tests the deduced consequences of the hypothesis. Once all the deduced consequences are after testing one come out to be true, the hypothesis is confirmed. If some of the consequences are true and some others are not, the hypothesis need to be examined afresh. The data collection tools should take into account all factors and conditions that are suggested by the consequences. Suppose the researcher want to test if some of the consequences are true and some others are not, the hypothesis needs to be examined afresh. The inference drawn as result of testing the hypothesis is always tentative. The null hypothesis asserts that there is no difference between the means, but some difference may always occur by chance. So, hence, when the obtained difference is greater, the null hypothesis cannot be accepted. The question arises as to how much can be the difference due to change, an estimation of which is provided by the values given in statistical tables. If the obtained difference is greater than the value 1, the null hypothesis is rejected. If it is accepted, if the obtained difference is found to have sufficiently small probability of occurrence. In either rejection or acceptance of null hypothesis. Two types of errors are always involved: type 1 error and type 2 error. They are also called alpha or beta errors respectively. These two errors are so related that if efforts made to minimize one error, then the chances of the other errors increases. In case of historical research, by using its internal criticism, external or internal criticism, a hypothesis is never proved. It is merely sustained or rejected. Although hypotheses are not always explicitly stated in historical researches, but they are usually implied. The historian gathers evidence and carefully evaluates its trustworthiness. If the evidence is compatible with the consequences of the hypothesis, it is confirmed. If the evidence is not compatible or negative, the hypothesis is not confirmed. So, it is through such synthesis that historical generalizations are established. In our next session, we will discuss characteristics of a good hypothesis.